The story of Henry Taylor's reign of terror begins in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with the seemingly unremarkable lives of Lauren Bailey and Daniel Cartwright. Both in their early 20s, they embodied a generation grappling with economic struggles and high aspirations. Lauren, a college dropout, worked part-time at a coffee shop, while Daniel juggled shifts as a delivery driver. They shared a cramped apartment and spent weekends browsing online forums for odd jobs to make ends meet. It was during one such search in August 2016 that they came across a posting offering a lucrative opportunity. A private estate in the countryside required assistance with cleaning and maintenance. The job promised $20 per hour, significantly more than either of them earned at their respective gigs. The contact for the job, Henry Taylor, described himself as a property developer and real estate agent. His email communications were polite and professional, reassuring the couple that the work would be straightforward. Taylor's name rang no alarms. A successful businessman in Knoxville, he owned multiple properties across Tennessee and had no visible red flags in his background. Yet behind the polished facade lay a dark and twisted history, one carefully hidden from the public eye. For Taylor, the job offer was bait, a meticulously crafted trap he had deployed more than once. On the morning of September 15, 2016, Lauren and Daniel packed their car with cleaning supplies and a lunch cooler. The property was located 2 hours outside Chattanooga, an isolated estate surrounded by dense woods. Google Maps showed no other buildings nearby, which seemed odd to Lauren, but Daniel reassured her. "It's probably why they're paying so much," he remarked, his tone optimistic. When they arrived, the estate was sprawling but eerily quiet. The driveway curved past an overgrown garden to reveal a weathered house that seemed abandoned. A locked gate blocked the entrance. Henry Taylor appeared moments later, driving a dark SUV. In person, he was unassuming middle-aged with graying hair, a slight frame, and a mild demeanor. He unlocked the gate and waved them in. The sense of unease Lauren had felt earlier grew stronger as they parked and stepped out. Henry's behavior shifted. His smile faded, replaced by a cold and calculating stare. Before Daniel could react, Henry produced a handgun and shot him in the chest. Lauren's scream echoed through the empty woods as her boyfriend collapsed to the ground. She tried to run, but Henry was faster, grabbing her by the arm and forcing her into his vehicle. The last thing Lauren saw before the SUV sped away was Daniel's lifeless body crumpled on the gravel. Henry Taylor's property, where Lauren would endure 2 harrowing months of captivity, was not the estate they had been led to believe it was. It was a secluded tract of land several miles away, shielded by dense forests and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. The site housed a cluster of derelict buildings, including a shipping container which served as Lauren's prison. Taylor's methods were as cruel as they were calculated. The container was soundproofed and sparsely furnished, a bare mattress on the floor, a bucket for a toilet, and a single dim light bulb overhead. The air reeked of damp metal and decay. He chained her to the wall, leaving her wrists and ankles bruised and raw. Food was scarce and water was rationed. Taylor's demeanor alternated between cold indifference and violent outbursts. He controlled every aspect of Lauren's existence, using threats and psychological manipulation to instill terror. He referred to her only as it or the job, stripping her of her humanity. Lauren clung to memories of Daniel, replaying their last moments together in her mind. Her guilt was overwhelming. She blamed herself for not sensing the danger sooner, but she also resolved to survive, using every scrap of strength to remain defiant. Meanwhile, Daniel's disappearance raised alarm bells back in Chattanooga. When he failed to show up for his delivery shift that evening, his employer contacted his family. Lauren's mother, too, grew frantic when she couldn't reach her daughter. By the next morning, both families had filed missing person report. Detective Richard Griffin of the Chattanooga Police Department was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for persistence, Griffin quickly pieced together the couple's movements. He discovered the job posting that had lured them away and traced it back to Henry Taylor. Taylor's name triggered a faint memory. Griffin dug into his record and uncovered a disturbing detail, a conviction for kidnapping and assaulting in 1889. Though Taylor had served time and claimed to have reformed, the parallels were chilling. Griffin obtained a warrant to search Taylor's properties. The breakthrough came when a tip from a local hunter corroborated Griffin's suspicions. The hunter reported seeing Taylor's SUV parked near a wooded area in early September, raising questions about why Taylor would be there. Acting on this lead, Griffin coordinated a raid on Taylor's property in mid-November. When law enforcement arrived, the scene was worse than they could have imagined. In a back corner of the site, officers pried open a rusted shipping container. Inside, they found Lauren Bailey emaciated, bruised, and trembling, but alive. Her rescue marked the beginning of the unraveling of Henry Taylor's horrific double life. Lauren's testimony would reveal the full scope of Taylor's crimes, leading to discoveries that shocked even the most experienced investigators. The rescue of Lauren Bailey marked the turning point in the investigation of Henry Taylor. Weak and traumatized, Lauren provided Detective Richard Griffin with chilling details of her captivity. She described the brutal murder of Daniel Cartwright, her own abduction, and the unimaginable conditions in which she had been held. But Lauren's account hinted at something even more sinister. Taylor's property seemed to have been used for far more than her imprisonment. As forensic teams combed through the site, the depth of Taylor's depravity began to emerge. Buried in shallow graves across the property were human remains in various states of decomposition. These discoveries sent shockwaves through the community and drew national media attention. The remains of Joshua Miller and his wife Emma Lang were the first to be identified. The Miller couple had vanished a year earlier under circumstances eerily similar to those of Lauren and Daniel. Like them, the Millers had responded to a job posting for work on private property. Taylor had lured them in with promises of quick cash, only to turn on them the moment they arrived. Joshua had been executed on site, while Emma was held captive for several days before being murdered. The forensic evidence painted a gruesome picture: bullet wounds, signs of strangulation, and evidence of prolonged physical abuse pointed to a methodical and sadistic killer. Taylor had shown no remorse as he recounted the fates of the Millers, offering only cold, detached details during his initial confession. But the revelations didn't stop there. Under pressure from investigators, Taylor began to admit to more murders, each confession more disturbing than the last. His crimes stretched back decades, involving victims from various backgrounds who had one thing in common: their disappearance had gone largely unnoticed. Taylor's confessions included a shocking revelation about the unsolved 2004 Speedline Motors murders in Knoxville, Tennessee. 4 employees at the dealership had been found shot to death, with no suspects ever identified. Taylor admitted he had been in a dispute with the dealership over a vehicle he purchased. His solution to the conflict had been cold-blooded execution. The discovery of these earlier murders shifted the focus of the case. Taylor was no longer seen as just a kidnapper or opportunistic killer. He was a methodical predator who exploited vulnerable people and situations, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives. As Taylor's confessions unfolded, investigators delved deeper into his history, uncovering a disturbing pattern of escalating violence. Born in 1961 in Knoxville, Tennessee, Taylor grew up in a troubled household. His father, an alcoholic, was known for violent outbursts, while his mother struggled to protect her children from his wrath. Neighbors recalled Taylor as a quiet but withdrawn child, prone to violent outbursts of his own. Taylor's first documented crime occurred in 1989 when he was convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a teenage girl. He served 6 years of a 10-year sentence, during which he was described as a model inmate. His release in 1995 was accompanied by the usual warnings to the community, but Taylor managed to stay out of trouble, at least on the surface. Forensic psychologists reviewing the case theorized that Taylor's time in prison had taught him how to mask his true nature. His demeanor became outwardly polite and professional, traits he used to manipulate victims and avoid suspicion. By the early 2000s, he had established himself as a real estate agent, using his profession as a convenient cover for his predatory activities. The Speedline Motors murders marked a turning point. For years, Taylor had preyed on individuals he could easily overpower: runaways, sex workers, and other marginalized individuals unlikely to attract significant police attention. But his dispute with the dealership introduced a new element: a willingness to commit multiple murders in a public and high-risk setting. Despite the brutality of the crime, Taylor had been meticulous in covering his tracks. He used a stolen firearm, wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and disposed of the weapon in a remote lake. Investigators at the time had no leads, and the case eventually went cold. Lauren Bailey's rescue provided the breakthrough that finally unraveled Taylor's carefully constructed facade. The DNA evidence recovered from his property linked him definitively to the Speedline Motors murders and several other unsolved cases across Tennessee. Forensic teams expanded their search to other properties Taylor had owned or managed over the years. At an abandoned warehouse in Nashville, they discovered evidence of additional victims, bloodstains, personal items, and even handwritten notes that hinted at Taylor's perverse need to document his crimes. The scope of his actions was staggering. Taylor's admissions, combined with the physical evidence, suggested he had killed at least 15 people over the course of 3 decades. Yet, investigators suspected there could be more victims, those who had slipped through the cracks, their disappearances never reported. As the case against Taylor grew, so did the media frenzy surrounding it. He was dubbed the Real Estate Reaper, a moniker that reflected both his profession and his chilling modus operandi. For the families of his victims, the newfound attention was a double-edged sword. While it brought long overdue answers, it also reopened wounds that many had struggled to heal. But for Lauren Bailey, the case was far from over. Her testimony would be crucial in ensuring Taylor faced justice, and her courage in confronting her abductor would inspire a nation gripped by the darkest corners of humanity. The prosecution's case against Henry Taylor was as complex as it was overwhelming. Taylor's crimes spanned decades and jurisdictions, requiring extensive coordination between local law enforcement, the FBI, and forensic experts. Detective Richard Griffin, who had uncovered the link between Taylor and Lauren Bailey, became a central figure in the investigation. His dogged determination to expose every aspect of Taylor's depravity earned him both praise and criticism as the sheer horror of the case unraveled. Lauren Bailey, still recovering from her physical and psychological ordeal, was kept under tight security. Her first-hand account of Taylor's actions became the cornerstone of the prosecution. To protect her from the inevitable media frenzy and potential threats from Taylor's remaining associates or sympathizers, she was moved to a safe house under 24-hour surveillance. Despite her fragile condition, Lauren insisted on cooperating with investigators. Her testimony was devastating. She described, in harrowing detail, the moment Taylor murdered Daniel Cartwright and the months she spent chained in the shipping container. But Lauren also revealed critical details about Taylor's patterns: his cold, systematic approach to killing, and his chilling admissions during her captivity. "I'm not the first, am I?" Lauren had once asked him, her voice barely above a whisper. Taylor's response was a smirk. "You're not even special." This offhand remark, combined with evidence found on Taylor's property, allowed investigators to link him to other missing persons cases. Forensic anthropologists identified 5 more victims through DNA testing, including 2 college students who had vanished in 12 while traveling through Tennessee. Taylor's property became a grim mosaic of his crimes, with each new discovery adding another layer of horror. The prosecution also delved into Taylor's psyche, enlisting criminal profilers to dissect his motivations and behaviors. Their findings painted a portrait of a man driven by power and control. Taylor's choice of victims, often young, vulnerable and financially desperate, spoke to his predatory instincts. He exploited their trust, using his professional demeanor as a weapon to disarm them. But Taylor's arrogance ultimately became his undoing. Investigators uncovered a trove of evidence in his Knoxville home, including photographs, journals, and trophies taken from his victims. These items, meticulously cataloged, revealed a chilling need to relive his crimes. Among the evidence was a series of Polaroids showing Taylor posing with his victims' lifeless bodies. This discovery, though sickening, left no room for doubt. Henry Taylor wasn't just a killer, he was a remorseless predator who had operated in plain sight for decades. The trial of Henry Taylor began in the summer of 2018 and quickly became one of the most sensationalized legal battles in Tennessee's history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and families of the victims, all eager to witness justice for the man who had terrorized their communities. Prosecutors faced the monumental task of presenting evidence for nearly 24 crimes, including 7 confirmed murders, multiple kidnappings, and assaults. The defense, meanwhile, aimed to avoid the death penalty by portraying Taylor as a deeply disturbed individual whose actions stemmed from mental illness. Lauren Bailey took the stand on the second day of the trial. Her testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Dressed in a plain black dress, Lauren spoke with a quiet resolve, recounting her abduction and captivity with unflinching detail. She described the moment Taylor killed Daniel Cartwright, the terror of her imprisonment, and the psychological games Taylor played to break her spirit. The courtroom was silent as Lauren spoke, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Her testimony was so powerful that even Taylor, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, appeared visibly uncomfortable. Prosecutors also presented extensive forensic evidence, including DNA, ballistics, and items recovered from Taylor's property. Jurors were shown graphic photographs of the crime scenes, including the graves of Taylor's victims. These images underscored the brutality of his actions, leaving little room for sympathy. The defense's attempt to paint Taylor as mentally unfit fell flat. Psychiatrists testified that while Taylor exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, he was fully aware of his actions. His calculated methods, meticulous planning, and ability to evade detection for decades proved that he was not only sane but dangerously intelligent. One of the most damning moments came when prosecutors played audio recordings recovered from Taylor's home. The tapes, recorded by Taylor himself, captured chilling monologues in which he described his crimes in graphic detail. "I figured it out," Taylor said on one tape. "People are disposable. The trick is knowing which ones no one will miss." The recordings shattered any remaining doubts about Taylor's guilt. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before delivering a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase brought more harrowing testimony from the families of Taylor's victims. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends spoke about the devastating impact of his crimes, their voices cracking with grief and anger. Lauren Bailey, too, addressed the court, describing how her life had been forever changed. "I lost the love of my life, my freedom, and my sense of safety," she said, "but I refused to let him take my future." Henry Taylor was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die behind bars. For the families of his victims and the community at large, it was a long-awaited moment of justice. But the scars left by Taylor's crimes would linger. For many, the trial was not just the end of Taylor's reign of terror, but a haunting reminder of the evil that can hide behind even the most unassuming facade. With Henry Taylor locked away for the rest of his life, the community of Knoxville and the broader region struggled to process the horror of what had unfolded. Taylor's crimes, hidden for decades, had ripped through the fabric of trust, leaving behind a mixture of relief and unease. Families of the victims worked to rebuild their lives, but the shadows of his actions loomed large. For Lauren Bailey, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a long road to healing. She returned to Chattanooga under the watchful eye of counselors, law enforcement, and her remaining family. Physically, she had recovered from the injuries sustained during her captivity, but the emotional scars ran deep. Nightmares of the shipping container, of Daniel's murder, and of Taylor's chilling smirk plagued her nights. Lauren chose to channel her pain into advocacy. Within months of Taylor's conviction, she partnered with organizations focused on victim support and crime prevention. Her story became a rallying cry for better protections for vulnerable individuals. She spoke at universities, law enforcement seminars, and public forums, urging others to recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior. Detective Richard Griffin, too, found his life profoundly altered. Though he had worked countless cases during his career, the Taylor investigation had left a mark he couldn't shake. The images of the shipping container, the graves, and the haunted look in Lauren's eyes stayed with him. Despite the accolades he received for solving the case, Griffin often wrestled with guilt over the victims he hadn't been able to save. As Taylor's name faded from the headlines, questions about how he had evaded detection for so long began to dominate the public discourse. Law enforcement agencies conducted reviews of their cold case files, uncovering missed connections and inconsistencies that, in hindsight, could have pointed to Taylor much earlier. In the wake of Taylor's conviction, a special task force was established to investigate unsolved cases that bore similarities to his modus operandi. Over the next 2 years, the task force identified at least 6 more victims whose fates had previously gone unanswered. Among these victims were 2 sisters, Mia and Grace Dalton, who had disappeared in 1998 while traveling through eastern Tennessee. Their remains, discovered buried in a remote section of Taylor's property, brought closure to a family that had spent decades searching for answers. Investigators determined that Taylor had lured them under the guise of offering a ride when their car broke down. Another case linked to Taylor involved a man named Luis Alvarez, a migrant worker who had vanished in 2010 after responding to an ad for farm labor. His remains were found in a different burial site on Taylor's property, identified through dental records and DNA analysis. But for every victim identified, there were countless others who remained nameless. Skeletal remains found on Taylor's property were too degraded for forensic analysis, leaving their identities and their stories shrouded in mystery. The task force issued public pleas for information, hoping to connect missing persons to Taylor's victims, but many leads went cold. The revelations underscored the devastating impact of systemic failures. Taylor had carefully chosen victims who were marginalized or unlikely to draw attention: migrant workers, runaways, and those with strained family ties. The lack of urgency in investigating their disappearances had allowed Taylor to continue his crimes unchecked. Public outrage grew as these details emerged. Advocacy groups demanded reforms in how missing persons cases were handled, particularly for adults. New protocols were implemented in Tennessee and beyond, prioritizing immediate action in cases involving vulnerable individuals. Even from his prison cell, Henry Taylor cast a long shadow. His notoriety made him a figure of macabre fascination, attracting letters from true crime enthusiasts and interviews from journalists. Taylor, ever the manipulator, used these opportunities to maintain an air of control, speaking in cryptic phrases and refusing to disclose the full extent of his crimes. His fellow inmates, however, viewed him with a mix of fear and disgust. Taylor's reputation as a serial killer earned him infamy, but his predatory nature also made him a target. Reports of altercations and threats against him surfaced within months of his incarceration. Guards maintained strict surveillance, aware of the danger Taylor posed not just to others, but to himself. Despite the safeguards, rumors swirled in 20 that Taylor had begun documenting his crimes from prison, drafting a twisted memoir meant to glorify his actions. Families of the victims demanded its confiscation, sparking a legal battle over inmates' rights to create and disseminate written material. The manuscript, if it existed, was never made public, though its mere possibility deepened the wounds Taylor had inflicted.